Extension, the resource conservation districts of Napa, Solano, and Yolo counties, and their subsequent prescribed burn associations. So thank you for joining us. Next slide. Okay, so the goal of today's training is to present the introductory topics and basics of prescribed fire, starting with the fire environment. Many of the topics that we'll be covering today are topics that could be discussed in great detail, but what we're hoping to do is provide a well-rounded overview. And whether you know nothing about prescribed fire, or if you are a land manager interested in using prescribed fire on your property, or you're just interested in participating in prescribed burns, this training will provide you with the foundational knowledge that you need to get started. So here's some of the things that we're going to be covering today. We're going to start with introductions, backgrounds on PBAs, prescribed fire, and then we'll get into some more of the deeper details, such as the fire behavior triangle, fuels, weather, topography, parts of a fire, hazards, and securing a burn unit and risk management. Next slide. Yeah, so before we dig into things, we're going to do some introductions for our speakers and support staff. I'll go first. My name is Bailey Adams. I am a project manager at the Yolo County Resource Conservation District. I split my time between managing restoration projects and working on community wildfire programming, one of which is coordinating the Yolo Prescribed Burn Association, which was established in January of last year. Go ahead and let Tori, our other speaker, introduce herself.
I'm Tori Norville. I am the Fire Science Advisor with UC Cooperative Extension. I cover Sonoma, Napa, and Marin counties. And yeah, I help with Napa RCD. We got the Napa PBA up and going this last year. And we've done one burn, I think, pile burns. So yeah, we're excited. And then Elizabeth.
Great. Yeah, my name's not on the slide, so I can drop my information into the chat, but my name's Elizabeth Davis. I work with Solano Resource Conservation District. I've been helping with coordinating PBA meetings and explorations here in Solano County, for those of you that are part of Solano County. And if you're interested in signing up for our email list and attending future burns, we are planning to host some pile burning in the future and hopefully some broadcast burns next spring. So yeah, I'll drop my info into the chat. If you have technical difficulties during today's meeting, what you want to do is you want to go to chat and you can select who you message. I'm the one you want to message. So look for my name, Elizabeth Davis, if you have technical issues, and you can message me directly. On that same note, as we're talking about the chat, it'd be really great to know who's here as part of this meeting. So again, talking about that little chat button at the bottom of your screen, if you could message to everyone, again, it should say everyone when you write to, we'd love to know what your name is, where you're at today, and then if you have an association with one of the PBAs or another organization. So if you want to just drop that into the chat, that'd be great. And I think that's it.
Awesome.
Cool.
And then just for questions, if people have those, Elizabeth, do you want people to direct that to the Q&A box instead of the chat so you can keep track of those?
Yes, but
awesome.
There should be a little section in the bottom that says Q&A. If you don't see it directly, there's a more button and it says Q&A. And if you drop your questions there, I'll be monitoring that and try and pull them up when it's time for people for either Tori or Bailey to ask or answer them during the presentation. The other thing is that if you have questions that are maybe a little bit more complex, it might be worth holding on to those questions until the in-person field day. And we may decide to push some of those questions to the next meeting as well if the content is more relevant. So we'll do our best to answer the questions. And if something ends up in the chat, I will move it over to the Q&A, but we will do our best to answer those questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Elizabeth. Okay, well, let's get started. First off, just a little bit about what prescribed burn associations are. PBAs, they can look and do things differently depending on the communities that they serve, but at their core, they all work towards the same goal. They are typically grassroots and community-led organizations that aim to provide community members with the education, training, and equipment that they need to implement prescribed fire. They operate by pooling resources and knowledge from the community to get burns implemented. And one of the most important components of PBAs are their members. The members are what create the community and volunteer base. They are the landowners using prescribed fire on their properties, and they're the driving force for getting good fire back on the landscape. Next slide. Okay, so what can PBAs do? Again, PBAs can look and operate differently, but there are typically some common aspects of what PBAs can do. This includes having more flexibility to implement prescribed burns than if you were to work with a fire protection agency to implement. They can also plan prescribed burns on an individual landowner scale and adapt the specific management goals that they have to meet those goals. One of the most common roadblocks for managers implementing prescribed burns is navigating the permitting process. Although the permits themselves are not very difficult, knowing which ones you need can be challenging, and PBAs can help direct you through that process. Lastly, they have the ability to connect you and your community to mobilize volunteers, determine training and education needs, and get prescribed burning happening in your area. Next slide. There are benefits to joining your local PBAs, some of which include access to the Yolo PBA gear trailer, which is pictured here. It has all the equipment and personal protective gear needed to implement a prescribed burn. This trailer will be at each of the field days for everyone to check out. And this trailer is something that our PBA brings out to burns, and we also have a tool lending program. If you're a landowner wanting to burn on your property, the PBA can assist with volunteers and coordination. Again, we can help with landowners to navigate the permit process to get the necessary permits needed to implement prescribed burning. And lastly, it provides accessibility to training opportunities like this one. What it means to join a PBA can look different. Some require annual fees or participation in certain amounts of events yearly. I won't go into the specifics of that right now, but I encourage everyone to consider joining or looking into their local PBAs. And with that, I'll pass it over to you, Tori.
Cool. So we are going to jump right in, and we're going to first talk about what is fire. Might sound pretty basic, but we're going to start there. So fire is really just a chemical reaction between fuel, oxygen, and a heat or ignition source. Those two things combine. The flame is the chemical reaction that we see, and the byproducts are smoke or particulate matter and more heat, which feeds back into producing more flames. So one of the very common ways we look at fire behavior, or just fire, is the fire triangle. And we'll kind of move along from there. I do want to put out there that cultural burning is involved in prescribed fire. And cultural burning is really the indigenous practice of the intentional lighting of smaller controlled fires to provide for desired cultural service, such as promoting the health of vegetation and animals that provide food, clothing, and ceremonial items. This is taken from the National Park Service. There could be very many different definitions of cultural burning. That's just the one I took for tonight. Prescribed burning in and of itself is just the intentional setting of fire under determined conditions to achieve a set of goals and objectives. And those goals and objectives could be fuel reduction, they could be to increase forage, to get rid of invasive species, get rid of pests and diseases. Yeah, it just depends on what you're trying to burn for. There's a lot of prescribed fire. I kind of named a few of them, but it also can be to recycle nutrients back in. It can help improve habitat. and just kind of reintroduce fire back into the landscape. California's ecosystems grew up with fire, and it is a natural part of the ecosystem. So if we can learn to use it as a tool, it'll be beneficial in the long run. So that was a very brief overview of fire just in general. Now we're going to move into fire behavior triangle, and this is where we're going to get a little bit nitty gritty with it. So we're going to have a second triangle for the night. And this is the fire behavior triangle. These three components are really what drives fire and how it behaves and moves across the landscape. So fuel, and we saw that in our first triangle, that's the only component that carries over to the second triangle. Fuel, topography, and weather are the three components for fire behavior. Fuel is anything that burns. It's vegetation. It could be our buildings, fences, things that we don't necessarily want to burn in a wildfire situation. In a prescribed fire situation, hopefully the only thing we're burning is vegetation. Topography is land. So are we hilly, mountainous, or are we on a flat valley bottom type of thing? And then weather is, are we hot, dry, and windy, or are we cool, damp, and moist? And we'll get more into this as we go, but that's just overview. So the first component we're going to talk about is fuel. And right off the bat, we know that there are live fuels and there are dead fuels, and they behave very differently. And they have lots of different components to them that we'll get into. But basically what I like to bring it down to, is it dead? Is it crunchy? Or is it alive? Is it kind of fleshy? Does it have moisture in it? Is it green? That sort of thing. The next fuel characteristic we want to talk about is sizing. And so sizing gets really important when we're trying to talk about what our fuel type is and how the fire is going to behave. So we have our smaller fuels. Well, first I'll talk about 1 hour, 10 hour, and 100 hour, why we call them hour fuels. So for 1 hour fuels, these are our smallest fuel. They are 0 to 1/4 inch in size, essentially. So they're teeny tiny. And it takes 1 hour for this fuel type to acclimate to the ambient weather. So if it just rained an hour ago, it'll take an hour for that 1 hour fuel to have the fuel moisture of the air. So yeah, that's 1 hour fuels. They're the teeny tiny ones. 10 hour fuels are 1/4 inch to 1 inch wide, so they're a little bit bigger. 1 hour fuels is 1 inch to 3 inches wide. So we just kind of progress up. Then we have 1,000 hour fuels, which are 3 to 8 inches, and then 10,000 hour fuels are over 8. So these are like your logs, your tree stems, that sort of thing. Whereas your 1,000 hour fuels, they can be the smaller tree sized or like very large branches. The important thing to really know with all of this with fire behavior is that your larger fuels, so these 1,000 hours and 10,000 hour fuels, they're going to be harder to ignite, but they're going to burn longer and hotter. They're going to be harder to extinguish. But because they're so big, they're harder to ignite. These smaller ones, particularly the 1 hour fuels, they're going to be easier to ignite because they're smaller. And they could be potentially easier to put out too. So that's kind of the takeaway of the sizing. Smaller the fuel, easier to ignite, easier to put out. Larger fuels, harder to ignite, harder to put out. They'll put out a little bit more heat, and they can sustain through a couple days. So this gets important when we talk about what happens after the prescribed fire and monitoring. We also need to talk about fuel arrangement. So arrangement is just how the fuels are set up across the landscape. So in this picture, we have continuous fuels. So is there a continuous fuel bed going from the start to the end, and the fire can carry all the way through, or is it patchy? And so there's gaps that there's no fuel there. So we have to kind of pick up pick up the fire with a jerk torch and move it to a different spot. When we get into kind of more chaparral or woodland or timber areas, what is the fuel continuity from the ground to the canopy? So do we have ladder fuels? Do we need to reduce those ladder fuels in order to keep the fire on the ground or not? So yeah, just the arrangement of fuels is how we just need to kind of know that in order to understand how fire behavior is going to move. The next really important component is the fuel moisture. So fuel moisture is just how much moisture is in that fuel. And these can fluctuate daily, but they can also fluctuate seasonally. So in the winter, fuels are typically more wet, whereas in the summer, it's hot, dry as well. But we can also get fluctuations during the day, and these can be very important to help us mitigate that fire behavior. Typically during the day, we start to see fuel moistures dip in early to late afternoon. And so we know that we might be able to see an increase in fire behavior because the moisture levels are going down, which means it's going to be slightly easier for fire to ignite and move through. So if we want more of a lighter touch burn, not quite as hot or spicy, maybe we look at igniting earlier in the day or later in the evening once fuel moistures start to go back up. This is the same with both live fuels and dead fuels. Dead fuels will usually fluctuate pretty rapidly. Live fuels, they don't fluctuate as much because they are continuously taking water and moisture up. Live fuels can kind of put a damper on a fire. So even if the dead fuels are really hot and dry and ready to go, that live fuel moisture might keep the fire cooler for us, which is a benefit. Or if you're trying to burn it a little hotter for whatever goals and objectives that you're working on, you might have to burn it more in this later half of the day, in that late afternoon time period. Next, we're going to talk about different fuel types. So kind of with this is along the lines of how are these burning? So your first fuel type is grassland. And I do want to caveat this, there's a lot of different fuel types. We just chose the fuel types that are across the 3 counties that we're working in. So Napa, Solano, and Yolo. So grasslands, there's lots of grasslands in all 3 counties. Grasslands, they burn really quick. So we call them flashy fuels. It's a flashy fire. It ignites fast, it burns quickly, and then it's done. It moves on fairly quickly. These are in wildfire situations, these are kind of where firefighters tend to get a little bit complacent just because they do seem not so scary sometimes, but there are a lot of grass fires that have hurt and killed firefighters. So even though they are very flashy, they can still be dangerous. So it's not, I just point that out because I don't want people to get complacent. Shrublands, and shrubland is kind of an all-encompassing term of chaparral, brush, just kind of that sort of ecosystems. These ones tend to burn a little hotter, or a lot hotter, just because those plants, their life strategy is to burn hot and burn all its neighbors hot, so that one's up post-fire. So these ones, yeah, they're just really hot. I've never actually burned in shrublands, but I'm looking forward to burning in it. It would be fun, I think. Woodlands, so we're classifying woodlands as like oak woodlands, and this is I know that there's lots of different categories of oak woodlands, but basically if you have an oak that covers 10% of the area, it would be classified as oak woodlands. These can also have some of that chaparral brush component to it as well. But for the most part, we should just be burning grass and the understory of these things. these get a little complicated, just because now you have a canopy, and so canopies can kind of be a little tricky to burn under, sometimes, but they can also be really helpful if you want to keep that fire, burning cooler. The canopies fire behavior, because they'll have higher moisture levels underneath the canopy level, and the shade component will also be very helpful. Oaks tend to do very well with fire in California. So even if you singe some of the understory leaves, the oaks should still survive fairly well. Timber is just kind of the all-encompassing forest term that is used with fuel types. And this is mostly looking at conifer timber or conifer forests, or mixed conifer forests with some hardwood component into it. Again, you're burning underneath a canopy, so your burn timing might get tricky. You're probably going to have a little bit more heavy fuel component. So that just gets a little tricky there. Slash component. So slash is just woody material that is left after a treatment, and that treatment could be a thinning, it could be like a shaded fill break, it could be not so much a mastication, but it could also be considered a mastication treatment. There's a lot of research that shows that doing a thinning and then doing a prescribed burn post thinning can be very beneficial towards wildfire resilience. The one thing that we are finding with thinning is that, or burning in slash, is that if there's a lot of material build up around the tree stems, you could potentially girdle the trees. So you would want to maybe think about either burning at a lighter end of your prescription, or removing some of that fuel away from the stems. So these are just some things to think about with those types. And then we have pile burning. So this is essentially taking some of this slash material and piling it up to reduce that fuel level, and then igniting the pile. The really cool thing about pile burning is that you can do it when it's not so great of a weather to be prescribed fire, or to use broadcast fire. So maybe it's too wet across the whole thing, but because the pile is very dense, you can get it to ignite and burn off that way. Yeah. So that was fuels. Elizabeth, was there any questions about fuels?
Nope, no questions about fuels. I'm watching the Q&A. Nothing right now.
Cool. All right, then we'll keep chugging along. We'll go to weather. Again, if you guys have questions throughout this thing, I'm one of those people who has questions after the fact. Just feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll get them answered. So now we're going to go on to weather. And we'll just start going along. Again, weather is it hot, dry, and windy, or is it cool, damp, and moist? So the first thing we talk about is temperature. And we kind of all know what temperature is, but temperature can influence those fuels. So a hotter temperature will dry out fuels faster, and cool temperatures can help retain that fuel moisture a little bit longer. Something to think about is, so if we've been hot and dry for so long, like in July, we had all those hot days, all the fuels are going to be really, really dry. Whereas in the winter, maybe we get a rain, and even though the sun comes out for a week, but the temperatures don't get above like 50, the fuel moisture is still going to be in there because the fuels haven't necessarily had time. That being said, sometimes in January we get what's called like January, and we get a really nice warming period in January after 3 weeks of rain or whatever. That is a great window to go in and do prescribed burning, because now the fuels have kind of done a little bit of drying. We can control the fire behavior pretty well. A really important component to weather is the relative humidity. And so this is just the amount of water vapor present in the air as expressed as a percentage of the amount needed for saturation at the same temperature. So really what we need to know with this is high RH levels, it's going to be higher for fuels to ignite. So if we're at 80% relative humidity is kind of really damp and we're probably like, ugh, I feel it in the air. It's gonna be really hard for fuels to ignite because they're gonna suck up all that moisture that's in the air. Low RHs, it's easier for fuels to ignite. So if we are down in, say, like 7% relative humidity, all the moisture in the fuel is being sucked out into the air. So wind is, we look at wind a lot when we're doing prescribed burn. Wind can be a hindrance, but wind can also be very helpful. So there's a couple levels of wind that we need to think about. These 20-foot winds and the mid-flame winds, these are kind of the winds that we look at that's going to affect the fire behavior just on the day of the burn. They're what's coming in and pushing those flames, or the flames are pushing against the wind. You want a little bit of wind when you're doing prescribed fire, just because it can help move the fire along, especially if you're you don't want too much wind because that can take your fire away from you. What we also look at is this kind of large scale synoptic winds. These are kind of what's going on throughout the region. Is there a storm coming in later, like the next day, or that type of thing? These kind of deal with high and low pressure systems. And these are more like the forecasting winds that we look at. Again, it's those region wide, we kind of want to know what's going on. This is largely looked at by like the burn boss and people who are actually putting on the burn. But it's a good thing to know and start thinking about. And then wind gusts can be, again, a help or a hindrance, but you don't necessarily want huge wind gusts when you're doing prescribed burn because it can, again, push your fire away from you. But the occasional wind gust might help like inch you forward if there's not a whole on that day. Anyway, basic wind. Then we start getting into your local wind patterns. And so everybody has a local wind pattern. There's kind of these regional local wind patterns. Like I know just in kind of the North Bay area, there's a wind shift every day between 1 and 3 p.m. It depends on where I am within that region that I can narrow it down, but we typically see a wind shift between 1 and 3 p.m. Knowing that will help do a prescribed fire because we can use the wind to our advantage, or we know that we need to get the burn done before that wind shift. So there's a couple things that could be playing with the wind shifts in this region. So some of us are next to oceans or have an ocean influence or even a lake influence if the lake's big enough. So during the day, the hot air from over the ocean will move in onshore and it'll cool off. No, that's not right. Cool air from the ocean moves inland, sorry. And then it starts to rise and then it starts to cycle back out over the ocean. So that's one of the winds that we see during the day. We'll get onshore winds. At night, this is where that wind shift comes in. It can be in the evening, that type of thing. It reverses. So now everything's going out towards the ocean. So an offshore wind. We also have a lot of mountains, valleys, canyons. Each canyon's going to have its own weather pattern, depending on where it's situated, what the aspect is. But kind of the same deal with mountains and valleys is as we warm up, all the wind is going to rush, or all the air is going to rush up slopes and create that wind. And then sometime afternoon, evening, we're going to get that wind shift and all the air is going to go down slopes. That direction. It's very similar with valleys. It'll go up valley and then back down valley or vice versa. So as a landowner who wants to do prescribed fire on your property, start taking note of the local wind patterns. Start, if you're working outside and you feel wind switched on you, take note of what time that is. And then let whoever comes out, like your burn boss, let them know about that local wind shift. As you're going out to work on other people's properties, ask about local weather patterns during the briefings that we do before we burn. Just so that way you kind of can know and be on the lookout for, oh, okay, they said around 2 to 2:30, there's usually a wind shift. So I'll pay attention during that time period and watch for that wind shift. So the next thing about weather is probability of ignition, or what we call PIG. And it's basically taking a lot of different weather information using a chart, and then that will give you the rating that describes the probability of a firebrand landing on a bit of fuel and causing it to cause a fire. So there's 3 components. You need the current temperature that you're in. You need to know your percent shading. So like if you're in a forest setting, you're probably going to have a higher percent shading than if you're in more grassland, then you're probably not going to have a whole lot of shading. And then you need to know your 1 hour fuel moisture content, which we can substitute in for the relative humidity. So hypothetically, let's say that we are in a timber stand that's probably 50% shaded. So they did a shaded field break. We are now coming in to prescribe PERN after that shaded field break for maintenance. So we're 50% shaded and it's 75 degrees outside. And our relative humidity is, let's say about 14. So you're gonna find your shading. So I said 50%, so we're gonna be in here. We find our temperature, which was 75, so we're gonna be in between 70 and 79. And then we said 14% relative humidity. So our probability of ignition is 20%. We have 20% chance of igniting a bit of fuel at that moment in time. And you take the probability of ignition, you can take it hourly if you're getting temperature changes. You can take it, basically you can take it whenever you want during the fire. Most prescribed burns I've been on, we took it hourly. And I think we'll work on that. That's part of the hands-on training, is to work on the probability of ignition. So you guys will have plenty of time to play with that. There's a lot of good forecasting resources out there. This slide has links to forecasting resources. The National Weather Service is a really super easy one to use that gives you lots of information. And I'll walk you through that in a little bit. Windy.com is really good for wind directions and speeds. You can kind of progress out a couple, I think, hours on that. And you can kind of look at like 6 hours past data. Your local RAS stations. So these are really useful if you have, stands for remote. Oh, I can't remember what the A stands for. But basically remote something weather station.
Automated.
Thank you. Remote automated weather station. So basically they're just sitting there taking weather automatically, and then they put it up for everybody to see. It's really cool. The problem is they're only in certain locations. So if you click this link, you can see if there's one nearby you. Otherwise, they're just more useful for like regional weather. If you have one right next to you, great. You can use it for more kind of fine-tuning weather. If you want to learn more about weather forecasting and all that jazz, this website here is really good and it can walk you through all of that. But really, the weather forecasting is going to come down to the burn boss and the people who are putting on the burn. But it is something that you should maybe, if you're interested in pursuing prescribed fire further, knowing how to forecast would be a good idea.
Hey, can I stop you, Tori? So we got a couple people that were asking for a definition of firebrand. That was a couple minutes ago, but just wanted to get that real quick.
Yeah. So firebrand is basically like an ember, or basically an ember. It's just a little spot of fire that will go out and ignite a fuel source. It could also just be a match. It could be something just small. Yeah, it could be the drip torch that's dripping a little bit of fire on the ground. But yeah, basically ember is the other term for firebrand.
Great. And then there's another question that's related to what you've been saying. So I just think answering it now would make sense. What is the best way to measure fuel moisture when determining if it would be better to burn in the morning or the evening? I'm going to assume you're going to say you're looking at the weather forecast as well as part of that to help figure those things out.
Yeah, so there's a couple different ways to measure fuel moisture. You can put out fuel moisture sticks. Nobody really does that unless you're a researcher like me. What most people do is they bend down and pull up like a handful of leaves and sticks and stuff and kind of see how crunchy it is. As you get more into, I'm not very good at that method. I'm still learning that method. But a lot of the burn bosses, they just kind of pick up fuel and crunch it and they're like, yes, we can light today, or no, this is really bad fuel moisture. Weather also kind of plays into that. Like if you know it's hot and dry, you probably don't, and it's summer, you probably don't want to ignite just because everything's going to be really crunchy. But yeah, those are kind of we can get really nerdy with it with fuel moisture sticks, or we can kind of just feel it and have experience to back it. But yeah, I encourage you all to kind of just play with those small 1 hour fuels throughout the year. So after rain, go out and feel them and kind of, they're probably going to be squishy, not so crunchy, and then go out and play with the same area in the summer, and it's probably going to be really crunchy.
Thanks. I've got one more question, but I'm not going to ask it now. We'll ask it in a little bit. So
Okay. I know, super scientific with crunchy and soft,
yeah.
but
The other thing I think you should add, Tori, so at the in-person training, we will be using weather tools. So that'll help with maybe answer some of those questions.
yeah. And I have a slide on some tools that we'll talk about at the hands-on training too. So like I said, National Weather Service is a really easy tool to use. This is kind of a zoomed out version of what you'll see if you just type in like Napa. I think I typed in Napa City for this one. But once you type in kind of your closest city, you can then use this map feature over here and kind of zoom in and find exactly your property and then double click on it, and it will give you weather for your specific area. Which I always find really cool because sometimes it's slightly different. And then it'll kind of give you this summary of the next 7 days or whatever. But then you can come down here to all these links, which is really where I start to get, this is where I start to get a lot of my information. You can look at the forecast discussion, and this is helpful because it gives you that region-wide perspective. It can let you know if there's storms coming in, can let you know if there's a wind event occurring sometime in the future. All these things that we want to think about before we put fire on the ground. We always want to see what the next 2 weeks is bringing us. Maybe week, 2 weeks. I've heard different terms, so at least 2 weeks or at most 2 weeks. You can get hourly weather forecasts to kind of like hone in specifically for that day of when you're burning. And then I didn't put it on this picture, but below this about this forecast, there's links to like and precipitation graphs and all that fun stuff. So I highly recommend getting familiar with the National Weather Service website and just playing around with different locations. So then we have some weather reading devices, and we will be playing with these on the hands-on training days. So we kind of talked about this one. This is the raw station. We won't be playing with this one just because we don't have access to them. But again, they could be very useful if they're around your prescribed fireplace. Sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't. The Kestrel and the Sling psychrometer. we will definitely be using at the hands-on training. Oh, and I can't see my notes for this one, but that's okay. The Kestrel is very easy to use. It's kind of basically just automated. You just kind of set it up, turn it on, and it takes weather for you. You can get the pig. It gives you relative humidity, wind speeds, all that jazz. And then the sling psychrometer. For Pete's sake. Technology. All right. The sling psychrometer is a cool tool. It's a backup to the Kestrel. So basically it's the old school way of how people took weather on fires before we got automated. So the sling psychrometer has two bulbs. It has a wet bulb and a dry bulb. The dry bulb will take the temperature of just the ambient air, and the wet bulb is wrapped in a damp muslin cloth, and then that basically gives you the relative humidity, or that gives you a temperature, and then when you combine the wet and the dry bulb, you get your relative humidity of the area. It's called a sling because you have to sit there and spin it, so it can be kind of fun. And yeah, we will definitely be playing with these on the field day. And with that, is there any questions?
I answered one, but it seemed a little complex for now since we're kind of short on time. It was just a little bit more complex. I did my best to answer it, and I need more questions back to answer it really more thoroughly. But I did drop some links actually in the answered questions. If anyone wants to look at the Q&A, I did drop stuff for looking up if you're in the SRA and where to apply for pile burning permits, because that link is in there too. So, and again, this will all become available after this is recorded. So this is being recorded, and we'll share the information.
Okay, so I think what we'll do now is we'll take a 5-minute break. We'll just call it 6:50. We'll start back up. We're doing pretty good on time. For those of you who don't need a break, if you have any questions and you think of those, just throw them in the Q&A or the chat. And yeah, we'll pick right back up at 6:50. Thanks, everybody. Okay, we're gonna get started. Elizabeth, can you confirm for me if I am sharing my screen in the right format with
You are. It says 5-minute break.
Awesome, thank you. Okay,
Great.
let's get going then. All right, so I am going to be talking about the final element of the fire behavior triangle. That is topography. Topography is the shape of the land surface and is composed of elevation, slope, aspect, and its features. Topography influences fire spread, fuel conditions, local fire behavior, and wind flow. An important example of this is when fires are burning upslope. It's not only going to be moving upslope, but the radiant heat will preheat and dry fuel upslope and can lead to faster spread rates. We're going to see a photo of this on the next slide. Okay, so I apologize for all of the text on these slides. I'm going to be reading at you a little bit, but these are important basic concepts for everybody to understand as we get into these topics. So it's important to note that of the three elements of the fire behavior triangle, topography is the most predictable. It's important to know how these features influence fire behavior and account for them in your burn planning. Slope is the degree of incline of a hillside. Fire will typically spread faster uphill, not only because of the fuel arrangement, but also because of the preheating of the fuels, as I mentioned before, which we can see well in this first image in the top corner. Not only is the fire going to be moving along the slope, but it's actually the radiant heat is preheating the vegetation up ahead, which is going to allow for that to burn even faster. Another component is aspect, which is the direction a slope is facing, and it determines how much sun exposure a slope gets. Because of our location in the northern hemisphere and the way that the Earth orbits the sun, the southern aspect or southern facing slopes get more sun exposure than northern slopes. We can see that here in the image, the second image below. The south facing slopes tend to have higher temperatures with lower relative humidity, drier fuels, and less fuels. Northern slopes, on the other hand, tend to have lower temperatures, higher relative humidity, moist fuels, and heavier fuel loads. So this is important when we're looking at a burn unit. It can tell us a lot about the potential fire behavior. The other thing is position, which is the location of a site relative to the location on a slope. This can have important influences on fire behavior, such as if you're lower on a slope in a drainage, fuels may be more moist and less receptive than fuels near the ridge or the top of the slope. Next are some topographic features. First, we have chutes. They are steep V-shaped drainages. They're fairly narrow and straight depressions that will lead up a ridge line. These can draw in the leading edge of a fire. Similarly, we have saddles, which are depressions between two hilltops, which we can see in the bottom image here. This one can, both of these features can accelerate fires, alter the flow of winds, and change the rate and direction of spread by acting like chimneys. So both of these are potentials for increasing fire behavior. On the other hand, in contrast, we have barriers, which are obstructions to fire spread. These can be natural barriers, such as rivers, rock outcroppings, or burned areas, or they could be man-made like roads, reservoirs, and fire line. And it's important to recognize how different features will impact fire behavior, either increasing it or decreasing it when we're planning for prescribed burns. Another important thing to be aware of in regards to topographic features is a slope reversal. This is when you have fire spreading one way on a slope and it reaches a point on the feature where it reverses. In this image, we can see how the fire activity is greater going upslope as it's spreading with the slope and preheating the fuels, but the fire intensity decreases as it begins to burn downslope on the backside. But in contrast to this, it would be important to know that as the fire intensity may be less while burning down the backside of the slope, when it reaches the bottom of those two hills, the fire intensity will again increase as it reverses to begin burning up the slope on the other side. There's lots of local examples for these. I put two that are in Yolo County, and that would be in the Puda Creek Canyon or in the Capay Valley. But these are really common throughout, Napa and Solano counties, anywhere that you have creeks or drainages or any type of rolling hills. Next, I'm going to be talking about the anatomy of a fire. First, you will have your ignition point, which here is the red dot in this image. This is the source of your fire, whether it's a wildfire, and this was, from lightning, or prescribed fire, which was intentionally done. These terms will apply to both, and you'll hear them commonly when CAL FIRE or fire agencies are talking about wildfires as well. There are three categories to describe the perimeter of a fire. The head or front of the fire is the fasting spreading part. It's usually the side towards where the wind is blowing and often upslope. You can see that in the top of this image here, the head of the fire. Then there's the back or the heel of the fire, which is opposite to the head, and it is usually minimal spread, and it's going against wind and slope, which we can see at the bottom underneath the ignition point here. Then you also have the sides, which are the right or left flanks of the fire. And these terms describe specific parts of a fire. However, there are also similar terms that are used to describe fire movement, which we have two different types. We have heading and backing fire. A heading fire is fire spreading or ignited to spread with the wind. So that is using the wind as a force, and it is going to be, again, where the fire is spreading the fastest. And then we also have a backing fire, which is fire spreading or ignited to spread into or against the wind or downslope. This is a really common one in prescribed fire because it offers more control, and you'll often see this being used on prescribed burn units. In prescribed fire, we get to choose which type of fire we implement, and based on what will achieve our goals for the burn unit, which will be covered in more detail when we discuss firing ignitions. So some more components. Oh, go ahead.
No, somebody asked a question about topography. Yeah. I'm writing it in the chat as well, but the question was, are east-west sides of a slope markedly different from each other? And you can answer it.
Sorry, our east-west, you cut out there. Our
sides of a slope markedly different from each other. So I think, again, that's related to the aspect.
Okay, yeah.
Sun.
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth. Yeah, so this, I'll go back to okay, so here's our aspect image here. Yeah, so it can be a lot of this when it gets down to like the east and west for where we're at. A lot of times you're going to have think about this, the western side is going to be a little bit more similar to southern because it's going to get more of that afternoon sun as opposed to eastern facing slopes, which tend to get, which are going to get the morning sun and when there's lower humidity, higher humidity. So those ones are, but they're not as drastic as the patterns that we see with north and south. But yes, there are some factors to think about when you're looking at prescribed fire. Those are a pattern that you'll sometimes see with that afternoon sun hitting on the western slopes. Okay, back to our anatomy. The next things I was going to talk about are some of the other special features Starting with islands, these are areas where fuels have not combusted within the fire perimeter. So that's right here. We can see that it's fully within the fire perimeter. Everything around it has burned, but this has been left unburned. Usually that'll also get referred to as like areas of green in a unit. Then we have fingers, which are, as you can see here, stretching off of the main fire. Fingers are long, narrow extensions of a fire that project off the main body. And then we have pockets, which is right here, kind of like looks like the indentation of the oven mitt here. Pockets are the unburned indentations in the fire's edge created by fingers. Then we have spot fires, which are here up at the top corner. Spot fires are ignited outside the perimeter of the main fire by lofted embers or firebrands, and these can appear miles in front, and these often indicate extreme fire conditions. In contrast, there's something referred to as slopover, which is different because slopovers are fires that cross a barrier or control line that was intended to contain a fire. So spot fires specifically are out in front of your main fire, whereas slopovers in a prescribed burn, for example, could be you have a containment line and it started to burn outside of that. But those are usually things that are immediately identified and put out. Okay. Next up, we have flame length. This is the distance measured from the average flame tip to the middle of the flaming zone at the base of the fire. That's kind of hard to understand. It's a little bit better if you look at this image. So it's not straight up and down. It is from the base of the ground and then at an angle to the front point of the flame. And this is not to be confused with flame length, which is just the distance measured from the ground to the highest vertical point of the flame. Flame length incorporates effects from wind and slope and tells us more about the fire behavior. Next, we have rate of spread, which is the speed at which the fire is moving away from the point of origin. This is impacted by wind, moisture, and slope. In prescribed fire, the rate of spread is an element that we plan for to be able to use to achieve goals. For example, whether we want it hot, whether we want the rate of spread to be fast and burn hot, to burn off invasive seed heads, such as in a grassland, or if we want it to burn low and slow to burn off thatch or leaf litter and a pine understory. Okay, so now we have different types of fires. First off, we have ground fire. This is below the surface. It's mostly in decaying roots below the ground and in the duff layer. These fires are sustained by glowing combustion and can be undetected because they produce little to no smoke and spread slowly. This is something to be aware of when you are conducting a prescribed burn and you want to secure your unit. If fire gets down below in the root system, you can think that you have a fire out, but it could pop up, a few days to weeks later if it gets into the root system. So that's something to be aware of when you're conducting a burn in your unit. The next one is a surface fire. This one burns the loose vegetation, shrubs, small trees, and saplings that are near or at the surface of the ground. This is the most common fire that we experience in prescribed fire. Then we have a crown fire, which is when the forest canopy fuels, which can be alive or dead, and they are burning in the crown, which we can see on this image here. This is a sign of very extreme fire behavior, and it's not something common that we see. Crown fire is different than torching, which I'll touch on that afterwards. A couple different fire behavior terms. We have smoldering. This is the stage that produces lots of particulate matter. the heat is lower and fuels are not consumed as efficiently. Smoke from smoldering stays near the ground. This image to the right here does a good job of showing the different types of behavior. Next, we have creeping, which is low intensity fires, which are less likely to kill mature trees. And a prescribed fire that is backing downhill can be a creeping fire. Again, with prescribed fire, we get to choose, through planning, we are able to choose what types of fire we apply to the landscape. And that is a common one that we would use. A running fire, however, is fire spreading rapidly with a well-defined head. This is really common in grasslands or up a slope. Sometimes that will be used in prescribed fire, but it is more difficult to control. So it's just something that has to be incorporated into your planning. Okay, and then as I touched on with the crown fire, torching is different than crown fire, as you can see in this photo here. Torching is the ignition and flare up of a tree or a small group of trees, usually from the bottom to top. So this is something that you'll see common with wildfires. It will occasionally happen in prescribed fires, and this is usually something that we don't want. Usually we're not trying to burn mature trees with prescribed fire, but it's these ladder fuels that get us to that point. Unlike a crown fire, which just moves actually from the canopy top to canopy top. Torching can be a single tree, a group, or a stand. Okay, so securing a burn unit and patrol plan. This is also sometimes referred to as mop-up with fire agencies, but securing a burn unit involves extinguishing all of the hot spots and any residual flames with the intention of making sure that the prescribed fire does not reignite. This is often the most time-consuming component for prescribed burning. It will look different depending on what type of fuels that you burn. For example, if you are burning and you have the 100-hour fuels, a lot of times you'll make burn piles within your unit because those are going to burn longer. However, if you're burning in grassland, maybe on a grazed land, the grasses often will burn off really quick. However, if it's cattle graze this land, there are cow patties, which actually will burn for a really long time. So there's factors like that that you have to consider how you're going to make sure that you secure the burn unit and how you're going to patrol to make sure that you don't have any reignitions. Other things that it could include are checking for burning stumps, smoldering ash pits, underground roots, like I mentioned before. But again, the primary goal is to ensure that the fire does not reignite. It will look different for every burn unit, depending on your fuels, what the likelihood of a reignition is. And that's something just determined when you specifically plan for your burn unit. So what that includes would be looking at upcoming conditions. Like Tori said, when planning and using your weather resources, one of the most important things you can do for planning to secure your burn unit is to take a look at the upcoming weather forecast. Knowing whether or not there's going to be high heat or high winds coming up in the days following your burn is important, because that is a greater risk. Or knowing if there's going to be rain in the forecast or cooler temperatures can also help you determine when the best time to do a burn is going to be. You also want to factor in location and risk factors. If you're in an area with a lot of receptable fuel near you or close to other neighbors and things like that, you might want to be taking some extra steps to make sure that you're securing your unit, as opposed to if you're, live out in the middle of nowhere, you're the one that has put in your control lines and you know that it's really secure. You're going to want to look at the conditions for not only the next few hours, but days and weeks, like Tori mentioned. The more you know, the better it is to be able to plan for that and make sure that you don't have a reignition.
Hey, Bailey.
And what? Oh, yeah.
Sorry. There was a really great question about checking for smoldering of underground roots. So is there any special techniques for checking for that?
You know, special techniques. A lot of times, so from my experience, I burned more in grasslands and in oak woodlands, and not so much in areas with a lot of brush or the underground roots. A lot of times it depends. I mean, you can try to avoid situations like that. You can also prep your unit. Say if you do have some areas with roots under them, and there's like a pine leaf litter or a duff layer, you can remove. That's a common thing that you'll see in that ecosystem when doing prescribed burning, is to remove the duff layer about 18 inches away from the base of these trees or from stumps. A lot of times I've seen avoidance more than anything. If that's not possible, it's really about patrolling. That's really common. A lot of times to the extent you can't mitigate for everything ahead. And so you just have to really make sure that you factor that into your plan. And sometimes patrolling does take you out, days, weeks, and that's not a problem. It just has to be factored for in your plan. But I don't know of any special tips or tricks to seek out roots that are underground.
I agree. But yeah, just checking and checking back in, because often you'll see smoke later on in maybe some of those areas. So it might become more obvious over time, because it might be smoldering for a while and you can't tell. It's just a patrol.
Yeah. Thanks, Elizabeth. Yeah. Okay, so continuing with the securing the burn unit and your patrol plan, that can look like a lot of different things, hand tools, water resources. Again, it really just depends on the situation, and you have to look at the factors and the risks. But it is usually the most time-consuming part of a prescribed fire. And so you're just going to want to make sure that that's accounted for. You don't want to start your burn in the afternoon and then be doing, you're securing your unit into the night. So it's just something that we really plan for when it comes to prescribed burning. Okay, so hazards. On wildfires and prescribed fires, there are a lot of different hazards that you could come across. Some examples are uneven terrain, slopes, rocks, stumps, logs, rolling logs, snags, which are dead trees, dead standing trees, and vegetation. You could also come across other vegetation that is an issue, such as poison oak. Then there's also things like wasps and bees. These are things that you need to keep an eye out for. Hopefully with prescribed burning, you can plan, and those are things that won't be in your burn unit, but it's really important to make sure that you're looking for these things. With prescribed fire, we try to mitigate. That's really what a lot of prescribed fire is mitigating for risk and hazards. And so we wear personal protective equipment, or PPE, to try and mitigate any risks for hazards. This includes long pants, long sleeves, often eye protection, leather boots, gloves, and depending on the prescribed burn that you're on and the complexity and who the landowner is, you'll sometimes have different expectations, but at a bare minimum, you want to make sure that you're keeping yourself safe and the people next to you safe as well. When it comes to the post-burn conditions and securing the unit, there are also hazards that you still need to look out for. Those would include stumps, logs, roots that could still be burning, like we were talking about. A really common one is holes where stumps or roots have burned out of, and it just leaves a hole in the ground. There's also burned out roots and trees that can be destabilized by fire. So again, snags, overhead hazards are a serious concern, which is depending on where you're burning and if it's, in a pine understory or maybe a woodland. A lot of times we'll wear helmets also. And then the biggest thing that you'll see with fire agencies and prescribed fire is situational awareness. This is something that gets talked about a lot. It's all about making sure that you are continuously observing and identifying your surroundings to be able to make informed decisions. there's a lot more that can go into that, but at its core, that's the best way to, again, protect yourself and the other people who are burning with you.
I'll ask another question, Bailey. I wrote an answer, but there was a question that was, do PBA volunteers participate in longer term monitoring / patrolling? I went ahead and said that usually that's the responsibility of the landowner after it's initially considered out, not the PBA at large. But if the landowner wants assistance, it is a community organization. So of course they can ask for help. And if people want to volunteers, whether that be neighbors or other PBA members, that is in everyone's best interest. But yeah, but generally when a PBA burn is done, it gets passed over to the landowner. So.
Yeah, I think Elizabeth answered that perfectly. Again, what's going to be needed for your securing your burn unit and patrol is going to vary depending on your fuels, your locations, things like that. A lot of times it's established, you know, depending on if you're working with, if you're in the SRA, the state responsibility area, and you're working with CAL FIRE, or if it's your local fire protection district, you may get input from them on what they would expect to see. Our PBA we did our first burn in Yolo County in in Cape. Last year, we worked with both CAL FIRE and the local fire protection district and came up with what they wanted to see as you know, a plan for patrol and for securing the unit. And actually, depending on the comfortability of whoever the fire agency who's in charge in your area is, they might also want to be a part of that. For example, we were working with the Cape Valley, the Esparto Fire Protection District, and they actually came out and did patrol on that unit too, just for their own comfort, and worked with the landowner on that. But one of the benefits of the PBA is a lot of times you end up burning with your neighbors, and they have a mutual interest in making sure that the prescribed burn goes well and that there are no reignitions. So it's another great aspect of the community burning, that you do have resources and other people to rely on as well. Okay, moving along, just a little bit about risk management. So this is just building off of, you know, the hazard potential for when you're participating in prescribed burns. A lot of the development for prescribed fire and the fire agency world is a lot of the format is taken. It's very regimented, is the word I'm looking for. So there's a lot of step processes and lists and things that, you know, firefighters and fire personnel agencies, they are very familiar with and live by, and prescribed fire often borrows a lot of these concepts. And one of them is risk management, because it is so important that we're all staying safe when we're out there burning. And so I'm just going to run through this really quick. Fire operations risk management provides a simple, universal, and consistent way to practice risk management. There are 5 steps. The first one is identifying hazards and establishing situational awareness, which we just went over. You want to attempt to determine any problems and recognize the need for action. Step 2 is assessing hazard potential. You want to assess hazards to determine risks by looking for things like fire behavior, snags, and unburned fuels. Step 3, developing hazard controls. You want to ask, what is the best approach to mitigate or control risks? A lot of times this planning is done on the higher level. You have a landowner or a burn boss who is thinking through these things, but it really is, if you're going to be working in this environment and participating in prescribed burns, it's really important that everyone be thinking about these things as well. Step 4, decision point, accept or not accept associated risks. Are there controls in place for identifying hazards? Are tactics selected based on expected fire behavior? Are instructions given and understood? A lot of times on prescribed fire, you'll be given a task. You'll become part of a group that is working on a specific task, whether that's holding or firing or things like that. And it's really important that if you're given a specific task that you understand, and if you need to ask questions, you should. And being able to do that makes the entire operation work more effectively and safely. And then step 5 is supervising implementation and evaluating effectiveness. Ensure controls are implemented and accomplished to standards. Again, this falls more on the burn boss or the landowner leading the burn. But again, it's really important that we're all aware of what's going on when we're participating in these kinds of prescribed burns. So we've really blown through it, and I hope that there are some more questions that we can talk about. But just as a preview for the next virtual training, which is on Thursday night, we're going to get into fire operations, which is going to cover things such as burn planning, unit layout, firing devices, firing patterns, firing principles, and holding. So that's what we'll be covering on Thursday night as the second and final virtual portion of this training. I just want to say thank you again for everybody who attended. We really appreciate you joining us for this. Here is our contact information and our information for the next virtual training. Also, to remind everyone, there is a field day component. There's one being hosted in all 3 of the counties, Solano, Napa, and Yolo. We encourage you to sign up and attend if you can. You do not need to pick any. You can select whichever field day best suits your calendar. It doesn't have to specifically be which county you live in. We'll be covering the same material at each of the field days. And yeah, Elizabeth, do we have any more questions?
Yeah, I've got
Cool.
a question I just typed an answer for, but
Okay.
somebody asked, they asked a question about fire insurance, which if they're talking about wildfire insurance, because they're saying that obtaining a fire insurance has been difficult. I suggested they get in touch with their local fire safe council, but if they're speaking to prescribed fire and kind of insurance or mitigate or related liability related to that, working with a certified burn boss, your burn boss can then apply for things. I have, I'm going to go ahead and post my contact info also in the chat and a link to my website at the Solano RTD website and the PBA page. We have a whole set of slides about liability that you can access on that page. And there's info about things that are specifically related to that, if that's what you're interested in. I have the other question. So somebody said, I imagine pre-burn mechanical treatment of fuels as a hazard mitigation. That's the question.
Wait, can you say that one more time? Sorry.
Yeah, I imagine that pre-burn mechanical treatment of fuels as a hazard mitigation. So yeah, you're transforming your fuels is kind of what that would be.
Yeah, so one of the biggest questions landowners will get is kind of like, where do I start? And sometimes prescribed fire isn't the best tool. Sometimes, you know, if you have, say, a wildfire went through and you have a and then it grew back, and then you just kind of have this mess of down trees and heavy fuels, and it's all mixed in, and you can't get, good control lines. Sometimes prescribed fire isn't the best tool for the job. You have to really look at the situation and make sure that, maybe it will require some pre-treatments, like you said, with mastication or mechanical. There's always ways to get to prescribed burning, but the path is really situation dependent on what makes the most sense. What are your goals? What are you hoping to achieve from prescribed fire? But yeah, doing mechanical work is a way that you can prepare your site and prevent some hazards. But it also just depends on what you're going to be doing with that. Sometimes with mastication or things like that, we end up just rearranging the fuels, and then you have wood chips, and then those are kind of their own fuel concern. So if you have specific questions about your property, I really I would suggest reaching out to either Elizabeth or Tori or I, depending on what county you're in, to talk about your specific situation.
Somebody would like to learn more about the science of ignition points and the use of water. I think if you guys have information on that or have resources, that'd be good to share. So.
The science of ignition points or
and use of water. Is this something that's going to be covered a little better in our next one? I don't know if this is something that we're really covering in this training, or if you guys have good resources to send them. That's what they're curious about.
Ignition points,
okay.
is that like as the prescribed practitioner igniting the fire, or ignition point as in like a lightning strike?
I'm not sure. So,
If they are referring to ignition points in the sense of firing operations for a prescribed fire, we will be going over that in the next part of our training and on the field day. And then I don't understand, I'm not sure what the water
Yeah.
component is on that, but
I'm not really either, but hopefully
Okay.
whoever you are, you can ask that question in person too, and maybe we'll answer that question also in the next half of the training, which is on Thursday. And Steve, yes, we will send the links to the emails about the permitting process. You can also access information on the permitting process, at least on the website link I dropped into the chat. So if you click on that SolanoRCD.org, there's a bunch of links to a bunch of things specifically about permits if you're interested. But we can share also the information from here. So
and I'm also, I know the permitting process can sometimes feel a little daunting to know what you need or anything like that. So even if you're not in YOLO, I'm happy to answer questions about that if anyone's having a hard time. So please feel free to reach out.
yeah, there's also our contact info on the
Yeah.
slides here. And then someone also asked how do you know when to stop a burn and start putting it out?
Okay, so that's the thing about prescribed fire is it's really all about planning. So when you're going to be putting that fire out, you're going to already have that determined before you even light anything. Yes, the situations can change, weather can change, things like that can change throughout the day, which may shift your plan a little bit, but you'll actually have already planned for that in your plan. That's the thing about prescribed fire. And this is one of the biggest things we talk about when it comes to the insurance and the liability and the risk is prescribed fire, especially on this level when we're talking about community burning and on the landowner level, it's all about planning. It's all about getting everything in a row, and you have a plan for what you're going to do, and then what you're going to do if that thing changes, and so on and so forth. And that's really our best tool and our best way to mitigate risk. And so there's a standardized California burn plan, which is really the basic, the first step form that someone would create either with a burn boss or with a PBA coordinator or something like that. And it really covers all of those things. Then also if they're in a situation, like I was mentioning with the weather shifting or let's say a wind shift or something like that, you're also going to have that in part of your plan. But at any point you're questioning how the burn is going, that's your point to put it out. As private landowners and things like that, we're not going to take risks that maybe agencies would be taking when they're conducting prescribed burning.
And I'll just add that every prescribed fire has a test burn that's done at the beginning. Right. So you get to put a little bit of fire on the ground, just like a dot here and there, and see how that behaves at the beginning of the day. As you move on, if you determine that the fire behavior is what you want, it's in your prescription of the plan that you have, then you can proceed forward. And everybody's kind of watching the fire as you go. If at any point it decides the fire shifts, the fire behavior becomes not what you want, that's where the burn boss or someone who's helped plan that fire says, all right, we're done lighting, we're going to work on holding and just keeping what we have where it is.
Great. And then one more question. It says, is there a typical fire return interval that prescribed burn should be conducted depending on fuel type? So just like it says, depends on fuel type. So go ahead, Bailey.
That's pretty much, that's spot on. Not only will it depend on fuel type, it'll also depend on your goals and objectives. So for example, the burns that I've been planning with landowners, typically they're on grasslands that are being grazed by cattle, and a common issue is invasive species. So yellow star thistle, goat grass, Medusa head, and so a healthy grassland might have a specific fire return interval. However, if we're trying to control these invasive species, there's going to be a particular fire return interval to control them. So for those 3 species that I just listed, typically you're going to want a minimum of 2 burns, 2 consecutive years back to back in order to get control of those species. And really, it just depends on what your goals are. That's a really easy way to plan. So if you have a species that you're going to try to control, you can look up that species, and often there is good research on whether or not controlled burning is even a good way to control that species. And then if you are to use it, when, how, and how long to use it for is a good way to plan. If you are just doing fuels reduction, a lot of times, again, that's just going to be based on the fuel type and what needs to be done in order to reduce those fuel levels. But a PBA coordinator or a burn boss would be able to answer a more specific question if you could just tell them about, your unit, and would be able to direct you to some sources that would give you that information.
That's it on our questions. So if anyone else has any more questions, you can either enter it in the chat or even go ahead and ask it yourself if you unmute yourself. But otherwise, I think we're done.
I'll just say one other thing that's kind of in line with, I think some of these questions that we're getting is just to further explain that the intention of these trainings and what we hope to get out of coordinating these PBAs is there isn't an expectation that someone would attend this training and then they'd be ready to go off and then burn their property all on their own. Really what we're trying to do is provide the basic information and training and connect people with resources, and through this process, build up people's skills and their confidence to be able to do this on their own property, and maybe down the line be able to lead a burn on their own property. But there isn't an expectation that people walk away from this and they have all the answers. We're really just trying to let people know that there are groups and people here who know this information and want to help you along with that process. So I really encourage, if anyone has specific questions, to reach out to one of the coordinators so that we can connect you with the right resources or give you the answers that you're looking for.
Yeah, on that same note, the intention is that you attend, if you've not burned before, attend one of the demonstration burns that are happening with the PBA. The goal of this base information is so that you're going to have a better idea of what's going on when you attend one of those too. So you're not just completely overwhelmed the first time. So it's just baseline knowledge.
Okay, well, unless anybody has any other questions, I think we'll go ahead and wrap it there. Tori and Elizabeth and I will stay on for a few more minutes in case anybody hangs around and wants to get in some last minute questions. But thank you everybody for attending. We really appreciate it. And we'll see you on Thursday night.